The unwanted auction. The auction house was alive with noise. Crowds of aliens, humans, and other strange creatures filled the large, dimly lit hall. Neon signs flashed in languages from across the galaxy, advertising rare creatures and ancient artifacts. The air smelled of smoke, metal, and something vaguely sweet but unpleasant. It was the kind of place where deals were made in whispers, and secrets were sold for a price. At the far end of the stage, chained and slumped on the cold floor, was an alien wolf. It looked ancient, with fur that was matted and dull. Its yellow eyes glowed faintly in the shadows, scanning the room with an intensity that made people look away. Sharp scars ran along its muscular frame, telling stories of battles long past. No one dared to approach it. The auctioneer, a four-armed alien with glowing tattoos, shouted over the noise, trying to sell the wolf. Lot number 72. A rare specimen from the distant Kalfar system. A battle-hardened warrior. Strong. Fierce. He boomed. His voice echoed across the hall, but few even glanced at the wolf. Too old, someone muttered in the crowd. Looks dangerous, whispered another. A group of aliens chuckled, shaking their heads. The wolf remained silent, its eyes fixed on the crowd. It didn't growl, didn't struggle against its chains. It simply watched, as if it were judging every soul in the room. Then a new sound broke through the chatter. The soft, hesitant footsteps of a human girl. Ellie wasn't supposed to be here. She had stumbled into the auction by accident while exploring the station. Dressed in a simple jacket and boots too big for her, she looked out of place among the wealthy buyers and shady dealers. Her wide brown eyes darted around the room, taking in the strange creatures and alien artifacts. She stopped when she saw the wolf. For a moment, Ellie and the wolf locked eyes. Something passed between them, an understanding, a connection. The noise of the auction faded in her ears. She didn't see an old, unwanted creature. She saw a fighter, a survivor, someone like her. The auctioneer's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Come on, people. Who will bid for this magnificent beast? Starting price minus 100 credits. Silence. No hands were raised. 75 credits. The auctioneer tried again, his tone more desperate. Still nothing. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know why, but she couldn't just walk away. Before she realized what she was doing, her hand shot up. I'll bid 50 credits, she called out. Gasps rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Ellie. She felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't back down. 50 credits, the auctioneer repeated, raising one of his eyebrows. That's barely worth the chains it's in. Do I hear 60? No one else moved. The wolf's glowing eyes shifted to Ellie, unreadable but focused. Sold, the auctioneer finally shouted, slamming his gavel. To the brave, or foolish, human girl. Laughter erupted from the crowd as Ellie approached the stage. The auctioneer handed her the wolf's chain, shaking his head. Good luck with this one, kid. You'll need it. Ellie didn't respond. She gently took the chain, her hands trembling slightly. The wolf didn't move, but its intense gaze never left her face. She wasn't afraid, though. There was something in its eyes that made her feel safe. As she led the wolf out of the auction house, the crowd's laughter faded behind her. She could feel people staring, but she ignored them. Her focus was on the creature beside her. What am I doing? She muttered under her breath. The wolf let out a low rumble, not quite a growl, but not a friendly sound either. Ellie glanced at it nervously. Okay, she said quickly. I know I'm probably crazy, but you looked like you needed a friend. The wolf didn't respond, of course, but for a split second, Ellie thought she saw its eyes soften. As they stepped into the cold, empty corridors of the space station, Ellie realized she had no idea what she was getting herself into. But one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. The silent bond. Ellie's small apartment on the edge of the station was nothing fancy. The walls were bare metal, the furniture mismatched and secondhand, but it was home. As she led the alien wolf inside, she wondered if her home would ever feel the same again. The wolf, whom she decided to call Shadow, walked in cautiously. Its yellow eyes darted around, scanning every corner of the room. Despite its battered appearance, it moved with a quiet grace that made Ellie feel like she wasn't the one in charge here. "You can sit, or, lie down if you want," Ellie said, gesturing awkwardly to a worn-out rug in the corner. She set down the chain, not sure if she should take it off. Shadow didn't growl or snap. It simply sat, curling its long tail around its legs. Ellie let out a nervous laugh. "I guess you're not as scary as everyone thinks." Shadow tilted its head slightly, watching her as though it understood every word. Ellie decided to give it some space and busied herself in the tiny kitchenette. She rummaged through her supplies, eventually pulling out a small packet of dried meat. "Here," she said, holding the packet out. "It's not much, but it's all I've got." Shadow didn't move at first. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, as if questioning her motives. Then, slowly, it leaned forward and sniffed the air. With a surprising gentleness, it took the packet from her hand, tearing it open with sharp teeth. Ellie smiled. "Guess you were hungry." The two sat in silence for a while, Shadow finishing the meat while Ellie watched from the couch. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this creature than met the eye. Those scars, the way it had looked at her in the auction, it all pointed to a story she couldn't begin to imagine. Later that night, as Ellie lay in bed, she found herself unable to sleep. Shadow was curled up near the door, its breathing slow and steady. For the first time in years, Ellie didn't feel alone. But just as her eyes began to close, she heard a sound that froze her in place. A voice, deep and rough, speaking in a language she didn't understand. Ellie sat up quickly, her heart racing. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the station lights outside. Shadow was still by the door, but now it was sitting upright, staring at her. What was that?" Ellie whispered. She knew she'd heard something. She wasn't imagining it. Shadow didn't answer. It simply watched her, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Ellie swallowed hard and lay back down, her mind spinning. The next morning, Ellie woke to the sound of movement. Shadow was pacing the room, its claws clicking softly against the metal floor. It stopped when it noticed her watching, tilting its head as if trying to read her thoughts. Ellie sat up, running a hand through her messy hair. "So, are you going to tell me what happened last night, or?" she asked, half joking. To her shock, Shadow let out a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. It almost sounded like a word. Ellie froze, staring at the creature. "Did you just talk?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Shadow's eyes narrowed. It stood still for a moment, as if deciding something. Then, in a voice that was gravelly but unmistakably intelligent, it spoke. "I did." Ellie's jaw dropped. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. "You can talk." Shadow nodded slowly. "I speak your language. Difficult. Long time. Since last use." Ellie stared at the wolf, her mind racing. "But how? You're not just an animal, are you?" Shadow didn't answer immediately. Instead, it sat down, its posture stiff and formal. "Not animal. Warrior. Exiled." "Exiled," Ellie repeated, stepping closer. "From where? What happened?" Shadow's ears twitched. "Long story. Dangerous story. You involved now." Ellie's stomach sank. "Dangerous? What kind of dangerous?" Before Shadow could answer, the lights in the apartment flickered. A strange hum filled the air, and Ellie's comm device lit up with an incoming message. "Warning. Unregistered activity detected. Bounty alert issued in your sector." Ellie's blood ran cold. She looked at Shadow, who had already risen to its feet. Its muscles tensed. "They found me," it said, its voice low and grim. The wolf's secret. The air in Ellie's apartment was thick with tension. The warning message still glowed on her comm device, but her attention was on Shadow. The wolf stood tall, its scared body rigid, its glowing yellow eyes locked on the flickering lights above. "What do you mean, they'd found you?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. She clutched her comm device, as if it might protect her. Shadow let out a low, rumbling growl, not one of anger, but of deep thought. "Hunters, they track me," it said in its gravelly, hesitant voice. "Long time. They close now." Ellie's stomach tightened. "Hunters? Who are they? Why are they after you?" Shadow turned to her, its intense gaze cutting through her fear. "I carry secret knowledge. Weapon, dangerous to many, valuable to more." Ellie blinked, trying to process the words. A weapon? Knowledge. This was more than she had bargained for when she'd impulsively bought the wolf at the auction. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice rising. "You not safe if you knew," Shadow replied, pacing the room. Its claws clicked against the metal floor, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. "Safer to hide." Ellie crossed her arms, trying to summon some courage. "Well, I know now, so you'd better tell me everything. What's this weapon? Why are they so desperate to find you?" Shadow paused, its ears flicking as if it were listening for something beyond the room. "Not weapon-like gun," it said finally. "Knowledge. Old technology. Kalfar's secret. Lost for centuries. I was guardian." "Guardian?" Ellie echoed. "Of what?" Shadow hesitated, its gaze dropping to the floor. "Key," it said softly. "To machine. Big. Old. Made by those before us. Could destroy planet or save it." Ellie's breath caught. A machine that could destroy a planet. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie, but the way Shadow spoke, the weight in its voice, made her believe it was real. "And now these hunters want the key," she said. Shadow nodded. "They work for others, those who want power. They will kill for it." The lights flickered again, and this time there was a loud thump from somewhere outside the apartment. Shadow's head snapped toward the door, its ears flattening against its skull. "They hear," it said, its voice a growl. "We must leave now." Ellie's heart raced. "Leave? Go where? We can't just run." Shadow turned to her, its expression unreadable but firm. "No choice. They find us. You, not safe here." Ellie looked around the small apartment that had been her home for years. She didn't have much, a few clothes, some old books, a holo photo of her parents, but it was all she knew. Now she had to leave it all behind because of this creature she barely understood. Still, something inside her told her she couldn't abandon Shadow. Not after what it had been through. Not after what it had shared. "Okay," she said, grabbing a small bag and shoving a few essentials into it. "But you'd better have a plan." Shadow didn't respond. It padded to the door, its movements silent and predatory, and sniffed the air. After a moment, it turned back to Ellie. "Follow. Stay close." Ellie slung the bag over her shoulder and followed Shadow out into the corridor. The station's artificial lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the metal walls. The hum of machinery filled the air, accompanied by the distant sound of voices. Deep, guttural, and getting closer. "Are they aliens?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Shadow replied without turning around. "Bounty hunters. Strong. Smart. Dangerous." They moved quickly through the station's maze-like corridors. Shadow led the way, its movements fluid and confident, as if it knew every inch of the station. Ellie struggled to keep up, her breath coming in quick bursts. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Docking Bay," Shadow said. "We steal ship. Escape." Ellie nearly tripped over her own feet. "Steal a ship? Are you serious?" Shadow stopped and turned to her, its yellow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You want love? Then trust me." Ellie swallowed hard and nodded. She didn't have a better plan, and something told her Shadow wasn't the type to joke around. As they rounded a corner, a loud bang echoed through the corridor, followed by heavy footsteps. Ellie froze, her heart pounding. "They're here," Shadow growled. It lowered itself into a crouch, its body tense and ready to spring. "Stay behind me." Ellie pressed herself against the wall, clutching her bag tightly. She could hear the hunters now, gruff voices speaking in a language she didn't understand, their footsteps growing louder. Shadow moved forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It seemed to blend into the shadows, becoming almost invisible. Ellie held her breath, her eyes darting between Shadow and the approaching figures. Suddenly, the hunters appeared, 3 tall, armored aliens with weapons glowing faintly in their hands. Their eyes scanned the corridor, and one of them pointed in Ellie's direction. "There," it barked. Before Ellie could react, Shadow sprang into action. It moved like a blur, its claws slashing through the air with deadly precision. The first hunter didn't even have time to raise its weapon before it was on the ground, groaning in pain. The other 2 opened fire, their weapons sending bolts of energy sizzling through the air. Ellie ducked, her heart racing as Shadow dodged the blasts with impossible agility. It leaped onto the second hunter, knocking its weapon aside and sinking its teeth into its shoulder. The third hunter hesitated, its eyes wide with fear. Shadow turned to it, blood dripping from its jaws, and let out a bone-chilling growl. "Run," it said, its voice a low snarl. The hunter didn't need to be told twice. It turned and fled, disappearing down the corridor. Ellie stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall. Shadow turned to her, its breathing heavy, and said, "Come." More will follow. Ellie nodded, her legs trembling as she followed Shadow. She didn't know what kind of mess she had gotten herself into, but one thing was clear: this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. The chase begins. The stolen ship hummed softly as it glided through the black void of space. Ellie sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands gripping the edges tightly. Her heart still raced from the chaos at the docking bay. Shadow had fought off more bounty hunters, while she fumbled to override the ship's security system. Somehow, they had escaped, barely. Coordinates locked. Shadow's deep, gravelly voice rumbled as it tapped the ship's navigation console with a clawed paw. The glow of the ship's controls illuminated its scared face, and for the first time, Ellie noticed how tired it looked. Despite its immense strength and quick reflexes, there was an air of exhaustion about the old wolf. "Where are we even going?" Ellie asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You keep saying we're running, but we can't just keep running forever." Shadow turned its piercing yellow eyes toward her. "Safe place. Old contact. May. Help." Ellie frowned, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "An old contact? What kind of contact? Someone who's going to betray us like everyone else seems to." Shadow let out a low growl, not of anger, but of frustration. "Trust, difficult, but this one fought with me, long ago, saved my life." Ellie sighed, leaning back in the chair. She didn't have many options, but Shadow hadn't led her wrong so far. Still, the constant danger was starting to weigh on her. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms. "But I hope you're right." The ship's autopilot engaged, and Shadow stood, its movements slow and deliberate. Ellie watched as it padded to the back of the small ship, where a storage compartment had been converted into a makeshift rest area. "Get some rest," Shadow said, its voice softer now. "Keep watch." Ellie hesitated, then nodded. She was exhausted, and she trusted Shadow, at least enough to close her eyes for a while. Ellie woke to the sound of alarms blaring. Her heart leaped as she scrambled out of the makeshift cot and into the cockpit. Shadow was already there, its claws dancing over the ship's controls with surprising precision. "What's going on?" Ellie asked, Her voice panicked. "Hunters found us," Shadow growled, its tone sharp and focused. On the view screen, Ellie could see two sleek, black ships closing in. Their weapon systems glowed ominously. Ellie's stomach dropped. "How? We're in the middle of nowhere." "Tracker," Shadow said. "Hidden on. Ship. Didn't check." Ellie cursed under her breath. Of course, the hunters would have a backup plan. "What do we do?" Shadow didn't answer immediately. Instead, it activated the ship's weapons system, the hum of energy cannons filling the air. "We fight," it said simply. Ellie's eyes widened. "Fight? Are you crazy? We're outnumbered and outgunned." Shadow shot her a glance. "No choice. Running. Not option." Before Ellie could argue, the first hunter ship opened fire. The ship rocked violently as energy blasts slammed into its shields. Ellie grabbed onto the console to steady herself. "Shields. Weak," Shadow muttered. "Can't take much." Ellie's mind raced. She wasn't a fighter. She'd never even held a weapon before, but she couldn't just sit there. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice trembling. Shadow pointed to a secondary console. "Weapons. Aim. Fire." Ellie's hands shook as she sat at the weapons station. The controls were unfamiliar, but the interface was straightforward enough. She locked onto the nearest hunter ship and pressed the trigger. A bolt of energy shot out, missing the target completely. "Focus," Shadow growled. "Breathe. Aim." Ellie clenched her jaw, forcing herself to calm down. She lined up the target again, this time taking a deep breath before firing. The bolt hit the hunter ship's wing, sending it spiraling out of control. "I got it," Ellie shouted, a mix of relief and disbelief flooding her. "Good," Shadow said, its voice steady. "Now, other one." The second ship was faster and more aggressive, weaving through their attacks and firing relentlessly. The ship rocked again as another blast hit the shields. Alarms blared louder, and sparks flew from one of the consoles. "Shields critical," Shadow said, its tone grim. "One more hit." Ellie's heart pounded. She fired again and again, but the hunter ship was too fast. "I can't hit it," she cried. Shadow's eyes narrowed. "Then, we trap it." "Trap it? How?" Ellie asked, her voice rising in panic. Shadow leaned over the console, its claws flying across the controls. "Fly close to asteroid belt. Use debris." Ellie's eyes widened as she looked at the nav display. The asteroid belt was dense, filled with massive rocks tumbling through space. Flying through it would be dangerous, but it might just work. "Are you sure about this?" Ellie asked. "No," Shadow said simply, "but best chance." Ellie swallowed hard and took control of the ship. Her hands shook as she steered them toward the asteroid belt, the hunter ship close behind. The proximity alarm screamed, warning of imminent collisions, but Ellie forced herself to stay focused. As they entered the belt, the hunter ship followed, its pilot clearly confident in their skills. Shadow took control of the weapons, firing at the asteroids and sending debris flying into the hunter ship's path. Ellie watched on the view screen as a large chunk of rock collided with the hunter ship's hull, tearing it apart. The explosion lit up the darkness, and Ellie let out a shaky breath. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Shadow didn't respond immediately. It slumped into the co-pilot's seat, its body visibly exhausted. "Safe, for now," it said finally. Ellie nodded, her hands still trembling. They had survived, but she knew this was far from over. The hunters wouldn't stop, and neither could they. "Where's this contact of yours?" Ellie asked, her voice steadier now. Shadow looked at her, its yellow eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Gratitude, maybe, or respect. Not far," it said, "but dangerous road ahead." Ellie nodded. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she wasn't turning back now. Not after everything they'd been through. A dangerous alliance. The ship glided toward a dark decrepit station floating on the edge of a dying star. The structure was massive but broken in places, with lights flickering weakly along its surface. It was a ghost of its former self, a place forgotten by the galaxy. Ellie frowned as she studied it on the view screen. "This is your safe haven?" she asked, her tone laced with doubt. "It looks like it's held together by duct tape." Shadow, seated beside her, didn't respond immediately. Its yellow eyes were locked on the station as if seeing a memory instead of the present. "It was great once," it said finally. "Now forgotten. Like him." "Him? You mean your contact?" Ellie pressed. Shadow nodded. "Old comrade. Saved me. In war. Trust. Difficult, but earned." Ellie sighed, leaning back in her seat. "Well, I hope he's still on your side. We don't have many friends left." As the ship approached the docking bay, a crackling voice came through the comm system. It was rough, deep, and laced with suspicion. "Unidentified vessel, state your purpose." Shadow leaned forward, pressing a button to transmit. "Zakor," it said simply. "It's me." There was a long pause before the voice responded. "Shadow, after all these years, I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Shadow replied. "Need help." Another pause. Then the docking bay doors creaked open, and the voice said, "Dock at Bay 3, but don't expect a warm welcome." The docking bay was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. Ellie followed Shadow as they descended the ship's ramp, her eyes darting around nervously. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, led by a towering alien with rough, scaled skin and glowing red eyes. "Shadow," the alien said, its voice a deep rumble. "You look like hell." "Zakor," Shadow replied, its tone unreadable. "Still alive." Zakor let out a barking laugh. "Barely. What do you want? And who's the human?" Ellie stiffened but said nothing, letting Shadow take the lead. "Need, safe place. Supplies. Help," Shadow said, standing tall despite its exhaustion. Zakor crossed his arms, his red eyes narrowing. "Help? You, of all people, asking for help. Last time we fought together, you vanished without a word. Left me to pick up the pieces." Shadow's ears flattened slightly. "Regret. But no choice. You know why." Zakor's expression hardened. "The Kalfar weapon." He glanced at Ellie. "Does she know what you're carrying?" Ellie spoke up, her voice firm despite her fear. "I know enough, and I'm here to help, whether you like it or not." Zakor's lips curled into a smirk. "Feisty. I like her." He turned back to Shadow. "Fine. You can stay, but you owe me. And I'm not risking my neck for free." Shadow nodded. "Fair." The group moved to a large chamber deep within the station, where Zakor kept his base of operations. It was cluttered with weapons, tech, and relics from countless battles. Ellie couldn't help but feel out of place among the hardened warriors and alien artifacts. Zakor handed Shadow a datapad. "This has everything you need to know about the hunters after you. They'd put a hefty price on your head, enough to make even the most loyal allies think twice." Ellie frowned. Why does everyone want this weapon so badly? What's so special about it? Zakor raised an eyebrow. "You don't know. Shadow, you didn't tell her." "Not all of it," Shadow admitted. Zakor sighed, leaning against a console. "The Kalfar weapon isn't just a tool for destruction. It's a key to something ancient and powerful. The Kalfar built machines that could terraform planets, cure diseases, even manipulate time. Whoever controls it doesn't just control a weapon, they control the future." Ellie's eyes widened. "And Shadow has the key to all of that." Zakor nodded. "That's why the hunters won't stop. They're not just after you. They're after everything you could unlock." As they spoke, the station's alarms suddenly blared. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice announced, "Intruders detected. Hostile forces inbound." Ellie's heart dropped. They found us. Zekor growled, grabbing a weapon from a nearby rack. Looks like your hunters are more persistent than I thought. Shadow turned to Ellie. Stay close. Trust no one. Ellie grabbed a small blaster Zekor tossed her way, her hands shaking. What's the plan? Zekor barked orders to his crew. Hold them off at the docks. Buy us time to get Shadow out of here. If they want to fight, they'll get one. As the group moved through the station, the sounds of explosions and gunfire grew louder. Ellie stuck close to Shadow, her mind racing. She wasn't a fighter, but she couldn't let Shadow face this alone. When they reached a secure room, Zekor locked the door and turned to Shadow. There's a way out through the maintenance tunnels. It'll lead you to a hidden dock where I keep a stealth ship. Take it and get as far away from here as you can. What about you? Ellie asked. Zekor smirked. Don't worry about me, human. I've been in worse scraps than this. Shadow placed a paw on Zekor's shoulder, a rare gesture of gratitude. Thank you. Just don't die before you pay me back, Zekor said, his smirk fading into a serious expression. And remember, whatever you're running from, it won't stop. You'll have to face it eventually. Shadow nodded, and with that, the group split up. As Ellie and Shadow disappeared into the maintenance tunnels, the sound of battle echoed behind them. Ellie glanced at Shadow, her voice trembling but determined. This is bigger than I thought, isn't it? Yes, Shadow said, its tone heavy. And far from over. They moved deeper into the tunnels, each step taking them closer to their uncertain future, and the secrets Shadow had yet to reveal. The final stand. The maintenance tunnels were narrow and dimly lit, their walls slick with condensation from decades-old machinery. Ellie followed Shadow closely, her heart pounding with every echo of distant explosions. The sound of Zekor's forces holding off the hunters filled the station, a constant reminder of how close danger was. Do you think Zekor can hold them off? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Strong, Shadow replied, its tone steady but grim. But hunters, relentless, cannot delay long. Ellie swallowed hard, gripping the blaster Zekor had given her. She hated feeling so powerless, so small in a conflict that seemed to grow larger with every step they took. But there was no turning back now. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through. The tunnels eventually opened into a cavernous docking bay hidden beneath the station. Unlike the chaotic, exposed main docks, this one was dark and silent, with only a single ship resting on the platform. It was sleek and black, its surface matte, and almost invisible against the shadows. This is it? Ellie asked, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Zekor's ship, Shadow said, padding toward it. Stealth, fast, our best chance. Ellie followed, her eyes scanning the bay nervously. Something about the stillness unsettled her. It's too quiet, she muttered. I don't like it. As if in response, the silence shattered. A deafening explosion rocked the bay, and Ellie was thrown off her feet. The ship's alarms blared as smoke filled the air, and from the shadows emerged a squad of hunters, their weapons glowing ominously. They found us, Ellie shouted, scrambling to her feet. Shadow growled, positioning itself between Ellie and the approaching hunters. Its glowing yellow eyes burned with determination. Stay behind me. The hunters moved as a unit, their leader stepping forward. This one was taller than the rest, its armor etched with intricate designs that marked it as someone of rank. It held a long, serrated blade in one hand and a plasma rifle in the other. Shadow, the leader said, its voice cold and calculating. You've run long enough. Surrender the key, and your death will be quick. Shadow snarled, its muscles tensing. Never. The leader's helmet tilted slightly, as if amused. You think you can fight all of us? Look at you, old, broken. You're no warrior anymore. Ellie saw Shadow's body stiffen at the words, but the wolf didn't waver. Old, but not weak, it growled. Still, fight. Before Ellie could react, the hunters charged. Shadow met them head-on, moving with a speed and ferocity that belied its age. Its claws slashed through armor, its teeth found weak points, and its sheer presence seemed to disorient the attackers. Ellie raised her blaster, her hands shaking as she aimed at one of the hunters. She fired, the bolt striking its leg and sending it sprawling. The adrenaline coursing through her made her forget her fear, if only for a moment. "Get to the ship," Shadow roared, its voice echoing through the bay. Ellie hesitated, watching as the wolf fought off the hunters with a strength she hadn't thought possible. But more were coming, and she knew they couldn't hold them off forever. "Shadow, come on," she shouted, running toward the ship and slamming her hand against the access panel. The door hissed open, and she turned to see Shadow still locked in battle with the leader. The leader swung its blade, catching Shadow across the side. The wolf let out a pained growl, but retaliated with a powerful swipe that sent the leader stumbling. "Shadow!" Ellie screamed. The wolf turned, blood staining its fur. Its eyes met Ellie's, and for a moment, she saw something she hadn't expected: regret. "Go," Shadow said, its voice firm but pained. "I follow." Ellie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Not without you." The leader recovered, its blade raised for a killing blow. Shadow roared, its body moving faster than Ellie thought possible. It tackled the leader, driving it into the ground with a force that shook the floor. "Ellie," Shadow growled, glancing at her. "Now." Ellie clenched her fists, every part of her screaming to stay. But she knew Shadow wouldn't forgive her if she didn't. With one last look, she stepped onto the ship, the door hissing shut behind her. Inside the ship, Ellie ran to the cockpit, her hands shaking as she activated the systems. The controls lit up, and the engines roared to life. She glanced at the view screen, hoping to see Shadow charging toward the ship. Instead, she saw the wolf still battling the leader, its movements slower now, its injuries taking their toll. The other hunters began to surround it, weapons raised. "No," Ellie whispered, her hands gripping the controls. "Come on, Shadow. You can make it." But Shadow didn't move toward the ship. Instead, it turned to face the hunters, its body low and ready to strike. It glanced at the ship one last time, and Ellie realized with a sinking heart what it was doing. "Shadow, no," she cried. The wolf didn't answer. With a final, earth-shaking roar, it leaped at the hunters, giving Ellie the opening she needed to escape. The ship's autopilot engaged, and Ellie felt it lurch upward. She watched through the view screen as the docking bay grew smaller, Shadow's figure disappearing into the chaos. Tears streamed down her face as the stars stretched into the void. Shadow had saved her, but at a cost she couldn't bear. And now she was alone. But as she stared into the endless expanse of space, she made a silent promise. She wouldn't let Shadow's sacrifice be in vain. She would find a way to finish what they had started, and to make the hunters pay for everything they had taken. Shadow's fight wasn't over. It was hers now. Redemption and new beginnings. The stolen stealth ship hummed quietly as it drifted through the vast darkness of space. Ellie sat in the pilot's chair, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the control panel. Her hands trembled as she clutched the navigation controls, her mind replaying the last moments in the docking bay. Shadow's roar echoed in her memory, a sound that spoke of defiance, sacrifice, and something far greater than herself. The weight of their journey pressed heavily on her chest, but she couldn't let herself stop now. The coordinates Zakor had given her were punched into the system, a destination on the edge of uncharted space, a supposed sanctuary, a place where she could regroup, think, and plan her next move. But as the ship sped through the emptiness, Ellie's thoughts were consumed by one thing: keeping Shadow's promise alive. The sanctuary was a small, hidden outpost carved into the side of an asteroid. Its surface shimmered faintly, cloaked in a field that rendered it invisible to most scans. As the stealth ship approached, a mechanical voice came through the comm system. "Unregistered vessel, state your purpose." Ellie hesitated before pressing the transmit button. I was sent by Zakor. He said this place is safe. There was a long pause, then a click as the voice responded. Docking bay open. Make it quick. The ship eased into the dock, the landing smooth but heavy with tension. As Ellie stepped out, her legs felt unsteady, her emotions still raw from everything she had been through. The docking bay was quiet, occupied only by a few humanoid figures dressed in worn, functional gear. They glanced at her but said nothing, their expressions unreadable. A tall woman with sharp eyes and short, silver hair approached, her stance authoritative. "You're the human Zakor mentioned." Ellie nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, my name's Ellie." The woman crossed her arms. "And Shadow." Ellie's chest tightened. "He didn't make it." The woman's expression softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "Shadow was a legend. If he trusted you, there must be a reason." Ellie straightened, finding strength in the woman's words. "He trusted me because we didn't have anyone else. And now it's my turn to make sure his trust wasn't wasted." The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Come with me. We have much to discuss." The woman introduced herself as Kale, a former soldier turned leader of the sanctuary. She led Ellie to a secure room filled with maps, datapads, and holographic displays. The room buzzed with quiet energy as others worked on deciphering intel and planning operations. Kale gestured to a chair. "Sit. You've had a long journey." Ellie sank into the seat, the exhaustion catching up to her. Zakor said this place was safe, but it doesn't look like anyone's relaxing. Kale smirked faintly. "Safe is a relative term. The hunters have their reach, but we've managed to stay a step ahead. For now." Ellie frowned, leaning forward. "Then why did Zakor send me here?" "Shadow said the key is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy." "How is this place supposed to help?" Kale sat across from her, her sharp gaze unrelenting. "Because you're not alone anymore. This outpost isn't just a hiding place. It's a resistance. We've been tracking the same hunters who came after Shadow. We know what they're after, and now we know who's holding the key." Ellie's breath caught. "You're saying you can help me?" "We can," Kale said, "but it won't be easy. The hunters aren't just bounty collectors. They're part of a larger network, controlled by powerful factions that want the key's secrets. If you want to stop them, you'll have to be ready to fight." Ellie hesitated, the weight of Cal's words sinking in. "I'm not a soldier," she admitted. "I'm just me." Cal's expression softened. "Neither was I. Once. None of us were. But Shadow believed in you, didn't he?" Ellie nodded, her throat tightening. "He did." "Then that's enough," Kale said firmly. "We'll train you, arm you, prepare you. The fight isn't just yours, Ellie. It's ours too." Over the next weeks, Ellie threw herself into the Resistance's training. She learned to handle weapons, pilot advanced ships, and navigate the intricacies of galactic politics. It was grueling and often overwhelming. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought of Shadow, of his sacrifice, of his belief in her. Kale became a mentor, pushing Ellie harder than she thought possible. "You're carrying more than a weapon," Kale told her one day during a training session. "You're carrying hope. Don't let it break you." Ellie didn't. She grew stronger, faster, more confident. The girl who had stumbled into an alien auction was gone. In her place stood someone ready to fight for a cause larger than herself. One day, as Ellie studied a holographic map of the hunter's main base, Kale approached her, holding a small device. "We recovered this from Zakor's station," she said, handing it to Ellie. Ellie activated the device, and Zakor's rough voice crackled through. "If you're hearing this, kid, it means Shadow did what he always does, put himself last. Don't let that sacrifice go to waste. The key is yours now. Use it wisely." Ellie's chest tightened as she closed the device. She looked at Kale, her jaw set. "I'm ready." Kale nodded. Then it's time to finish what Shadow started. As the Resistance's fleet prepared for the final assault on the Hunters, Ellie stood at the helm of her ship. The weight of the key hung around her neck, a constant reminder of the responsibility she now carried. But for the first time, she felt ready. The stars stretched before her, vast and endless, and Ellie took a deep breath. Shadow's fight was now hers, and she would see it through. For him, for the galaxy, for a future worth fighting for.